Da, 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 da. So it's the first Kafe of 2014. I'm sitting here with John. We had a little chat beforehand, and we thought let's mix it up a little. Oh, and please forgive any outside sounds you might hear because Katy and her new house have some construction. Let's try and minimize that. Anyway, we thought, hey, let's do something a little different this time, and the band are in the studio finishing up their 14th album, and it might be interesting to hear their thoughts on what they think their perfect album is. So John is first in the Kafe, and I actually sent a tweet to fans saying, what do you think John's going to pick for his perfect album? And nobody guessed. So let me introduce you, give you the floor, and let's talk about your perfect album.
All right. Well, I had to go back to what I knew so well, and it's David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust album. And oh wow, where do we start? I mean, it's interesting to be discussing albums because sometimes I feel like the album is a dying art. I'm always, whenever I get into conversations with people about albums these days, they tend to say, well, I can't remember the last time I listened to an album all the way through. But as an artist who really cut his teeth on making albums, for me, I still think very much when I'm in the studio with the guys, we are thinking about how this album is going to hang together and how it is going to play as an album. Much the same as I'm sure playwrights think in terms of Act 1 and Act 2, or maybe Act 3, regardless of whether, anybody listens to albums anymore. we have to have a format. And to me that, Ziggy Stardust is one of those albums that really was a blueprint for perfection. So we could talk a little bit about why this album does it for me. And of course it's all perfect, and one man's perfect album is another man's piece of crap, Right. I mean, this is just my taste. But it's an album that I can go back to. However, I didn't know that at the time. Looking at the track listing, I think one thing that's interesting about it is it sort of gets going quite slowly. It doesn't come out of the box blasting. The single is the 4th song on the album. And I think that there's something about that is that's interesting. I'm going to mention it. I'm trying to avoid it, but I have to mention the Daft Punk album. Because for me, looking back on last year, for my taste and what I'm looking for in an album, I found that the most satisfying album of the year. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It took us on a journey. We entered their heads, and that album also sort of starts very low, in a very low-key way. There's a certain confidence about doing that we don't need to throw it all at you in the first few bars for fear that we're going to lose you. Mm-hmm. We're confident in this set of songs that you're going to take this ride with us. And I think Ziggy Stardust does that. It starts with 5 years, which is, it's a sort of an apocalyptic, dystopian ballad. Could almost be off one of John Lennon's early solo albums. David Bowie had a very good ear for American slang. And around about this time, one of the things that he was doing as a writer, as an English writer, he was really hip to American idiom, and he used a lot of Americanisms in his songwriting. And in 5 years, you get a lot of that. you also get a sense right away. The other really important thing about this album is the arrangements and the way that the songs are put together, and that's mostly about Mick Ronson, but we'll get into that later. The second song on the album is Soul Love, and again a very low key. It's one of my, I loved song transitions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I think about albums that I love, it's usually I think about the transitions from one song to another, and I love the way that the drums end 5 years. This fading drum part, and then Soul Love is like. It's just like as if it's as if it's live, and the drummer's just like faded out, and then he's just started the next song, and it's like they're picking up the tempo, but they're still not throwing the kitchen sink at you. Soul Love's one of the most kind of soulful, Bowie songs. I think it's very different to 5 years. It's a very personal song. It's about relationships. It's not sci-fi. And then Moon Age Daydream is track 3. Moon Age Daydream is probably the first great sort of Ziggy rock anthem. And, it's... and that's really where Mick Ronson comes into focus. And, Mick Ronson is the difference between this album and all the albums that David Bowie had made before this. Mick had played on other albums before, but he hadn't been as involved. Mick Ronson, anybody that knows anything about me knows, how highly I rate him. I think he's one of the most gifted arrangers and guitar players of the 70s. And whether he was playing, all of his guitar parts are interesting. He never overplays. On almost all these songs, you're left with lyrical impressions and melodic impressions, and most of the melodic impressions are coming from Mick Ronson's guitar playing. Or on Moon Age Daydream, we get this fantastic string arrangement coming. To me, Moon Age Daydream raises the temperature of the album after the first 2 songs and says, "Whoa, okay, this is not just another album." The first couple of songs, could have been on other albums. Moon Age Daydream could only be on Ziggy Stardust.
Okay. I'm following along with you. I have the album up. I don't think you mentioned who produced the album.
Well, Ken Scott produced the album with David Bowie.
Okay.
And we had a relationship with Ken later on. Ken actually managed Missing Persons. Ken did Ken was one of the most important producer engineers of that era, working in London, and he'd worked with David before. I think he engineered or co-produced Hunky Dory. Yeah, before this. I mean, it's a beautifully recorded album. I mean, I don't need to go into the history of how the musicians came together.
Right.
I don't know that that's particularly important. I think what's more important is what makes an album perfect. What are you looking for? And I'm looking for a ride. I'm looking for a party. I'm looking for a vehicle. I mean, I'm always looking for a ride. Always, whether it's a movie or a book or an album.
Right.
And and David does take us on a ride with this. And Moon Age Daydream is the first hint of Bowie world. And even though this album, I think, is David's 6th album, it's the first album that really, that really got under people's skin. And part of that was because he projected himself. The image of David Bowie around this album was of a man from outer space.
Right.
And they kind of got confused. The punters, started confusing David Bowie with Ziggy Stardust. And Ziggy Stardust being this kind of like, rock star from outer space. And Moon Age Daydream sort of suggests that, and then it's followed up by the song number 4, which is Starman.
Mm-hmm.
Starman's probably one of the most talked about songs in British pop of the last 30 years. It's a song, particularly with, the press that David Bowie was getting, a lot of the retrospective articles and documentaries that were out about him last year. A lot of people, a lot of my peers, like Gary Kemp, would say seeing David Bowie perform Starman on Top of the Pops was the turning point. That was when I realised I wanted to write songs.
Mm-hmm.
That I wanted to. It was a very powerful performance. It's a beautiful song, Starman.
Mm-hmm.
It's a it's a love song for an alien.
Yeah.
And
you guys covered it on an anniversary, right? In Greece, I think it was.
Yeah, we did, and hopefully it's going to see the light of day.
Yeah.
But it was one of those songs, kind of like Anarchy in the UK, that if you kind of had to write an evolution of the history of British youth, in song, Starman would be in there. And that was the point at which it was okay for guys to dye their hair, wear makeup, and still be tough.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of bisexuality, that kind of like where Clockwork Orange, David took the look for this album from Clockwork Orange.
Mm-hmm.
So he was, it's hard and soft at the same time. And I think that, Starman, it was one of those songs that I was driven to, I think I wrote about it in my book, driven to get on my bike, ride around the neighborhood, until I found a copy of it. I had to have it. I had to own it,
Yeah. But do you, and this doesn't have a lot to do with this being a perfect album, but just wondering, did people older than you, like parents, still think that David Bowie was weird? That it was weird that you were drawn to this? Did it make you sort of like a punk rock kid? I was thinking in the 80s,
Definitely.
For me,
Yeah.
like Boy George was safe. It wasn't like so weird.
Who?
But Boy George was safe.
Well, that was much later.
Right.
But I
No,
would
that's
say
what-
there was a mystique around Bowie,
Mm-hmm.
and there was this questionable sexuality that he projected, and I didn't go shouting around the house that I was into David Bowie.
Right. That's what I was wondering.
I mean, just being a fan of David, as a guy being a fan of David Bowie, it could be, that could be construed. Oh well, then you must be homosexual then.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There was something vaguely dangerous about entering the world of David Bowie in 1973.
Right. That's what I wanted to know. Yeah. It was still, he was edgy. I mean, he was not common.
No. And he really carried it off with tremendous aplomb.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'd got the confidence as a singer-songwriter, but he knew that wasn't enough to be the star that he wanted to be. And so he had to, he got involved in the Andy Warhol crowd, and and he really amped up his image. And so by the time, he debuted Starman on British TV, and that was the first taste really that the public had of this album. The fact that it was a devastatingly beautiful, heartbreaking song,
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't what people were talking about the next day.
Right.
Nobody was saying, "Wow, that's a great song that David Bowie had." They were like, "What the fuck was that? Who was that guy? What was he wearing? And and he shaved his eyebrows, and all of that." I mean, that was what people were talking about. But you kind of have to have both things going on in our business, to impact. And you can. Image will take you a long way. strong image, mediocre material. You can have really strong material with mediocre and a mediocre image. But when the two come together and you've got strong material with a strong image, you've really got something.
When you were 12 or 13 and you heard Starman on Top of the Pops for the first time, did you understand the depth of the song, or you just loved the song?
Yeah,
Did the depth of it come later? Yeah.
Yeah, and I wasn't analysing, and I didn't get to investigate the album as a whole for quite some time later. I couldn't afford albums at that time, and I think the first album that I bought was the next album, which was Aladdin Sane.
Okay.
I came back around to buying Ziggy later on. I probably didn't get into the Ziggy Stardust album until for a few years later, but when I did, I realised. That this was the one. This was the bedrock upon which the whole Bowie, legacy. Really, it was gonna, the song that follows Starman, that closes Outside One, because this was, most of the listeners are gonna appreciate that an album is made up of two sides. Side one, side two. Both sides you can get about five songs on. I think Rio has 10 songs, two sides of 5 songs. One of the things that changed, I think, when CDs came in was artists started releasing extremely long albums, and our listening attention was stretched so far that people stopped listening to albums. Especially with an album, you could put on one side, 5 songs, 20 minutes maybe. That's a no-brainer, isn't it? Putting on a CD, which could last an hour and 10 minutes, well, halfway through you're probably going to leave the room and you're going to go and get something to eat, and you're going to come back in and you're going to say, Jesus, is this album still playing?
Right.
A friend of mine always said that great albums always have to have one song for the intellectuals. Now, I'm not sure I can explain that, but on this album, it ain't easy.
Okay.
That's the song. It's the one song that David didn't write. It's the one song that almost you're not quite sure why it's on the album. It doesn't seem to fit into the story. It's written by, I think it's written by it was recorded by Long John Baldry, who Rod Stewart had sang with.
Well, I'm looking at something and it says Ron Davies in parentheses. So would he have written it?
Yeah. I mean, it was an obscure track, and so what the artist is doing there is showing you his depth of appreciation. It's a way of showing your credentials as an artist, really.
Okay.
So that's what that serves. There's a fantastic live album, David Bowie at the Santa Monica Auditorium, and I remember it's generally available now. You can buy it on CD, you can get it on iTunes. But when I was a kid, that album was a bootleg, and I loved that album, and it was basically off this tour when the tour came to Los Angeles. And so you get to hear these songs in the context of all the songs that he'd written before, because he'd already written some fantastic songs, like The Man Who Sold the World, Changes, Life on Mars, Space Oddity. I mean, he'd written some brilliant songs, but he wasn't a star. This was the album that made him a star. And star is a theme that goes throughout side 2. Lady Stardust and Star are 2 of my favourite songs of his. They are both bitter, glitter sweet. He was kind of obsessed with the Velvet Underground. Bowie was one of the first Brits to really get into the Velvet Underground. And you can hear that, I think, on Star particularly.
Okay.
And then you've got Hang On To Yourself, which is sort of not dissimilar to Moon Age Daydream. It's another one of the sort of epic rockers. On the Ziggy Stardust tour, I think they opened the show with that, and Mick Ronson. If you see the Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars live concert film that was recorded at Hammersmith Odeon, which is absolutely essential. Mick Ronson is just formidable throughout. And they open the show. They open the show with "Hang On to Yourself," and actually, once you've listened to the live version of "Hang On to Yourself," the album version is pretty tame, but it's still kind of beautiful. Ziggy Stardust, the title track, which Bauhaus had a hit with, actually was never one of my That was never one of my favorites. That's one of the most popular songs off the album.
Okay.
Never quite did it for me. I'm not quite sure why. It's a song that if I didn't hear it again, I wouldn't mind. It's probably my least favourite song on the album, actually. I can't explain that. Okay. Suffragette City, however, which is another song that Duran had played and recorded. Actually, I don't know if we've recorded, but we used to play it as an encore around about the time of Planet Earth.
Oh, wow.
Suffragette City is another sort of another very Velvet Underground inspired song. It's got some fantastic use of synthesizer bedded deep in the track. It's a fantastically trashing. How can I say? It's not blues rock, it's not heavy rock, it's trash rock, and I think it's perhaps the best example of British trash rock ever. There's some moments on this album that I have, that I have listened to over and over and over again. Lifting Up the Needle. It's one of those albums where. What makes a great album? I would say a great album is an album that, when you want to get up, it gets you up.
Yeah.
And when you want to be down, it takes you down. It's like, I want to dance. Ziggy Stardust will get me dancing. I want to cry. Ziggy Stardust will get me crying.
Right.
And the album finishes out with Rock and Roll Suicide, which is, it's an extraordinary finale. It's an extraordinary closure. It's a journey, and the journey ends with a suicide, with a tragedy. The album is a tragedy, but quite perfect for that.
Do you always listen to it on vinyl?
The last time I listened to it, yes, it was on vinyl, but I can only listen to vinyl if I'm at home. If I'm on the road, then I'm going to have to listen. I've listened to it over the years. I've listened to it on vinyl and CD and cassette tape. There's something special about playing it on vinyl. You're probably going to get the best out of it if you listen to it on vinyl. It's been remastered for CD, and you can get it on MP3, but I'm not sure that you're going to get the best out of it. I kind of feel like it was built to be listened to in a particular way, and there's and you're probably going to get the best out of it if you listen to it the way that it was intended to be listened to.
Did you ever get the chance to speak to David about this album? Like, would you, would it be too silly to ask? Not silly, that's the wrong word. Would it be too, this is this is very personal to you, I can tell, this album. So to find out sort of the machinations behind it might take away from that for you. Yeah,
I don't want to know everything.
Right.
I've read a lot about it over the years,
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to know everything. That would spoil. I know enough about it to enjoy it, to still enjoy it. I don't know if any kind of sort of any supplementary information about it could increase my enjoyment of it. I mean, I don't know how much is left. It's kind of reached, once an album enters this pantheon, it means I can listen to it about once a year. I have to preserve the experience. You know, I don't like listening to individual tracks. I like to sit down. It's like uncorking a bottle of vintage wine, which most you know I don't ever do. So this is like taking Ziggy Stardust out and putting aside the next 40 minutes to listen to it is going to be as quality an experience as I'm going to have. It's going to be a very special, very personal experience.
So would you say, in you're to me of the four guys in the band, you're the most invested in listening to new music, as well as you have a wonderful encyclopedic knowledge of music. In your life, how many perfect albums are there?
Oh, God, I don't know. I started thinking about that.
Do you have like 10 perfect, because my husband, Brian, who you know, he keeps track of his perfect albums. And he's at like 20 now. He thinks he has 20 perfect. I know, that's a lot. I said, that's a lot. He doesn't think it's a lot. But how many perfect albums do you think you have?
Well, you know what? I could have quite a good time trying to figure out what 20 might be. You'd be surprised if I told you what I thought the next one I would choose would be.
Tell me. Was it Kanye?
Tommy.
By the Who?
Yeah.
Oh, I could get down with that one more than I could get down with Ziggy.
Yeah.
I have an older sibling that was very into. That brings me a lot of great sense memories.
They've got to tick a lot of boxes. You know, they've got it. For me, they've got to have a high degree of emotionality. They've got to have tremendous moments of sadness, but they've got to have tremendous moments of vigor and gnarliness.
Are you sure you're not Irish?
I've got Irish blood in me.
Oh, okay. You sound an awful lot like Brian. John, this has been fascinating. And I love doing this. I'm so glad that you are the first band member that we did this with. I definitely like to do it again. I don't know at what point we'll come back to talking about a perfect album, but something tells me, knowing you the way I do, that if I asked you to do this in October, your choice won't be Tommy. But maybe it will. I don't know. I know you.
Right.
But thank you for spending this time in the cafe. Okay. And I think the next time we speak to you is in June, so you have a little bit of time to think about it.
Okay.
All right, you take care, JT.
All right, Katy, lots of love. Say hi to Brian.
I will. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.